So thinking back and going back to the earlier part of these first section of lectures, we learned about Vasco da Gama, even talking about with the last chapter, should I say, that we covered, um, getting in contact with the Indian Ocean and Europeans tapping into those markets, right? So remember, here was Portugal, and then sailing along the coasts of Africa, kind of hugging tight and making way around into the Indian Ocean. And as I pointed out, Indian Ocean was dominated by Muslim traders, and but we see by the early 1400s, Portuguese were making their way along the African coastline, setting up trading posts, dealing with gold. Of course, gold's always going to be important to people who are involved in markets, right? Salt's important, pepper, and then trading for guns, cloth, and copper. And of course, Europeans, just like we saw with Tokugawa Japan, everybody wants guns. And the Portuguese would compete with Muslim traders. Okay, and that's something we've kind of already learned about in the other chapter, like I mentioned. The first shipments of slaves by Portuguese occurred in the 1440s, and it was mainly for sugar plantations along the African coast. By the 16th century, Brazil had large plantations for growing sugar, and by the 17th century, Spanish, Dutch, French, and English set up sugar plantations. It's a very terrible irony, right, that sweetness, something that we all enjoy, a birthday cake, candy, something to put into your coffee or tea, rum, that all these things, the flourishing of sugar was at the expense of brutalizing African people on these large plantations. I don't know, sometimes you just got to think about that. How, when it comes to products and what we get and buy and all these different things, that the behind the scenes kind of thing is not always, doesn't correlate with the experience we have with the products, such as sugar in this case. But sugar is a major impetus for the slave trade, unfortunately. So what developed was the Atlantic system, and by the 18th century, more than 6 million slaves sold. Now, the picture here on the left is famous, but this portrayed how black Africans were basically packed into ships as cargo, like sardines. You can only imagine, chained up, people defecating on each other, women chained to men, possibly being raped, possibly being chained up to a dead person for days on end. Quite a horrifying, grotesque aspect of the slave trade. This was just merely transporting human beings as cargo. And then, of course, the survivors had to exist in a life of hard labor. Some slaves were put in conditions better than others, while others, like in the West Indies, had a very, very rough existence. And so here you can see on this map how the system of trade, right? So we have the Middle Passage, as it was called, for blacks being sent from Africa to the Americas. We have tobacco, cotton, sugar, rum, coffee, alcohol, like all of these products that we enjoy, textiles and clothing, but built on a system that relied on slavery. Okay, so that's that. Now, like I kind of already mentioned, slavery was common in Africa, but slavery, it just like with Islam, it wasn't necessarily hereditary. Slavery, there was upper mobility in slavery. Again, I'm not apologizing for any form of slavery, but just to say that slavery in Africa was different. It becomes much more fatalistic when it's based on skin color in a society dominated by white slave owners, right? So an African slave that's a black African could be in a village and perhaps earn their way up and become free and not stick out as an inherently a person that was a slave, or their children or grandchildren wouldn't necessarily stick out. But in a society where slavery is based on color, black means permanent servitude, right? But the slave trade was profitable for also wealthy opportunists, or people who are going to become wealthy through opportunism within Africa itself. So 16th to 18th century coastal kingdoms gained weapons and wealth by doing trade with Europeans. Wealth shifted from the interior to the coast. So you used to have nations that were more wealthy in the interior of Africa. With all this trade going on and this demand for slaves and for resources, obviously powerful, strong men, or sometimes strong women, who are going to exist along the coastal parts of Africa are going to make some serious economic opportunities. Mali, 13th to 15th century, was a very prosperous country, very powerful, and Mali is one you want to get to know about. Now it's simply associated with, terrorism again in the news, and the French using a reason to intervene in African affairs, or the issue of terrorism, all this kind of stuff. So anyways, it was lost to a kingdom called the Songhai, and that empire lasted in the early 1500s as a very wealthy West African state. They brought in Arab scholars, but Moroccans, you see on the top north here, Morocco crossed the desert in 1591 with guns and Portuguese mercenaries and abolished that kingdom. So European involvement, again, is helping change even the balance of power within Africa at this time, okay? So these are some aspects of European involvement that I just want you to think about that was taking place even back then. And so we're talking about Arabs before, then Europeans, and then mixing this all in, bringing up guns, massive slave trade, and we're going to see more about that in the next set of videos.